All right, looks like we're going. And I will be trying to pay attention to the group chat and things like that, but feel free to toss those questions in as you will. Jim Groom, welcome. I feel like I should have two ferns here just so we can sit between, but
Hello, everybody. How are you?
yeah, thumbs up from everybody. So let's go ahead and let me just have the students introduce themselves and also kind of what they do and maybe why they were interested in or forced to take this class, kind of to give some context there of why they're here. And I'm going to go ahead and call out to keep the sequence going. So let's start with you, Erin.
Hi, I'm Erin Walton, and I am in this class for two reasons. One, because I need an elective for my master's, but also I'm a high school English teacher, and every year they make us teach something on digital citizenship or digital something or other, and so I'm here to learn a little bit more about all of that.
Great. Great. Heidi.
Hi, I'm Heidi Olson. I am the Learning Design Coordinator for UAF eLearning. So I work with Chris. I'm also an instructional designer, and I'm working on the ONID degree, the Online Innovation and Design Education degree, and this is a required class. And I mentioned to Chris it probably wasn't something I was absolutely interested in, but I was forced to take it, and now I'm really glad I am, because it's broadened up some things and brought back some ideas and thoughts about what I've been working in, for the last 20 plus years. So I'm really having fun with it, and I'm excited that you're able to join us.
Absolutely. And I dig the pictures behind you. They remind me of something out of True Detective.
And Heidi is in sunny Juneau, so she gets to work from her house on the hill.
Yeah, people in like Anchorage and maybe rural Alaska, that's even a little north, like pissed at the Juneau people. Like, that's not really Alaska. Like, you're not really.
Well, maybe right now where there's a special legislative session going on, yes, but not Heidi. So, Linnea.
Okay, hi, my name is Linnea. I'm nearly done with my PhD degree through Colorado State University. It's in public communication and technology, and I needed to take a couple credits this summer. So because of residency things, I decided, I'll try taking something through the UAA system. So this is a fun class for me because I get to explore an area of literature that the topics are discussed a lot in my field, but are discussed from a very different perspective, not from instructional design or education technology, but more from this perspective of communication and communication technology. So it's fun to see the overlaps and the differences here in this class.
Yeah, that would be a topic in and of itself, right? Those two, because communications has a very similar theory, like McLuhan and all that, but education obviously does its own thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's very different.
And I think there must be some message in there for me to figure out that I think Linnea in part took this course because it was pretty inexpensive, but she's learning to love it. So that should be something to say about it.
That's the argument for OER we were looking for.
There you go.
Well, yeah, I had to take 6 thesis credits, and if I took them, like thesis credits that require you to do absolutely nothing, but if I did that, it would be like $8,600. I was over it. So I said, I'll learn something and actually interact with people and pay a lot less. Isn't that funny?
It works for me.
Yeah.
By hook or by crook. Martha.
Hi, I'm Martha Middleton. I'm kind of the odd man out. I work for an educational publisher. I've been with Hope Mifflin Harcourt for 17 years on the adult ed content development side of the house. I am pursuing an ONID degree, and this is a required class. I'm learning a lot. It's been real interesting throughout the process to hear the viewpoints of educators, people who are actually frontline in the classroom. And this class is of particular interest when we're looking at things like digital rights management, copyright protection, fair use, and other legal terms that I'm steeped in every day, but from the other side of the house. So it definitely builds perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting too. And can I ask you, what is ONID? Just so I get a clear idea of what that acronym is.
Yeah, so that's a master's degree in education, and that's the online innovation and design is Own It, and that's the program that Heidi is in, and maybe a few others here too. I can never remember who's in and who's in doing other things.
So they're doing like innovation and design for
Yeah,
educational experiences. Okay, cool.
yeah, it's
Sorry.
an instructional, basically a kind of a flavor of an instructional design degree.
Great. Thanks.
So I'm sure that since we are actually, Jim, I should let you know, this class is broken up into kind of 4 phases, and we are leaving the primary digital citizenship phase as is, and moving into intellectual property and fair use and copyright, etc. So there'll be some interesting discussions there potentially to be had during this hour too.
Yeah, I'm probably the most worst possible representative. So anything you hear coming out, I am not a lawyer. I just play one on TV. But yeah, be careful of that.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Nick. Not sure if Nick, we can't hear you if you're trying to talk. Nick's connecting from Bethel. We didn't have a chance to check in. Go ahead. I'm going to move on to Sarah and Nick while you check with your audio and maybe check in the group chat. Sarah. Oh, wait. I see Nick's microphone activating. Can you hear us, Nick? All right, let's move on to Sarah and we'll come back to Nick. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Carstensen. I'm in the Masters of Secondary Ed program, and I'm taking this as one of my elective classes. I took digital storytelling, and this one because I'm interested in doing some online, like coursework or adding some online digital class elements I teach.
And Sarah's being modest because some of her blogging explorations into the topics of the class have been very deep and engaging and interesting and bringing in a lot of interesting research. So hopefully she'll dig in here a little bit too. Valerie.
Hi, I'm Valerie. I am doing this as part of the ONID program, so I'm also in that Masters of Online Innovation Design program. And then let's see, I've been teaching political science at UAA for a couple of years, and so my previous master's was in international relations. So this is kind of a jump away from what I'm used to doing, but it's really interesting, and I'm really enjoying it. So.
All right, and let's try one more time to see if Nick is able to hear us and or talk to us. Nick, can you hear us? Oh, he can hear us for sure. So he might just end up using the chat for this, but...
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there we go.
All right. So I had 2 different mic mutes, and I didn't realize that because I'm using headphones I've never used before. What are we doing? I'm introducing myself. I teach adult ed in Bethel, so I'm actually teaching today. I'm sneaking away from my class for a couple minutes, and so I will probably not stay with you the whole time. But I'm also one of those ONID Masters people. Anything else you want to know? What's that?
ONID Masters.
Yeah.
Get together. Form of a huge Voltron.
It's Transformers. We will transform. So let's go ahead and jump in. There are a number of topics we could talk about. We only have an hour, but the reason that I wanted to bring Jim in was both to talk about the ideas of Reclaim, what led to domain of one's own and Reclaim hosting, just that whole thing, because to me that is a significant aspect of digital citizenship. We can delve into things like DS-106, which I'll let him try to explain because I am no good at trying to synopsize what that experience/thing is. But that ties also into the ideas of collaboration, participation, agency, and then of course copyright and intellectual property. And I'm not, we're not here to have Jim be legal counsel for us. I'm here to hear about how he, in the world that he's trying, the vision he has for participation and agency and creation, where that works with and against and around copyright and intellectual property as it stands, which I think has a lot of limitations and problems. So Jim, why don't you tell us maybe a little bit about, since people have seen you in the Digital Facelifts presentation and seen some of your work on Reclaim Your Domain, kind of where that's at now for your thinking and what you're doing.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks again for having me, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for attending and sitting through this. So I'll give you a very quick kind of how I got to the point I'm at, just so there's context. So you're like, why is this guy talking to me, with weird stuff in the background? I can't stop looking at the radio. Why is he talking to me? About 10 years ago, I actually was working on my PhD in American literature and in film. And about the same time, 11 years ago to be specific, my first son was born. And my wife was born and raised in Italy. And one of the things that, as our kid was growing up the first few months, one of the first things that we really challenged with was, how do I communicate back, or how do we communicate back our images and all the stuff that we're doing? Like, we could do by email, right? But I wanted to actually build a little bit of a shrine. And this has some kind of personal implications. And everything I do has personal implications. I'm sure it's true for everyone. It's not going to be very academic in that, right? I grew up in a family of 7. I was the youngest of 7, or the second youngest of 7. And by the time my mom got around to having me, there were no pictures. There was no evidence of me till I was like 12. That had an impact psychologically. So cut to me having my first kid, and I did the same thing my mom did on my third kid, but I took pictures, I made videos, and I actually came across this software in 2005 called WordPress. And I'm going to actually show you a site I built back in 2005, so give me a second. I'm going to share it with you, and it's called Planet Miles. No, that's not it. That's someone else's site. Give me a second. And, oh, here it is. And it's actually a site that I started in February of 2005, and I kept it going until 2009. And as you can see, this was my place to actually document for my wife's family in Italy all the different work and all the different kind of just growings up of this kid. And I started making mashup videos. I started going to the archive.org. I made one where we actually, let me see if I can find it, where we actually did the duck and cover. How many of you kind of remember the whole duck and cover? There's a Star Wars one that is great. Oh yeah, here it is, right? And so this is my first playing with media. I went in and I created a mashup video where I was using iMovie. This is 2005. I had been taking, it was one of those little kind of videos. I was taking this whole idea of my kid coming to be as a kind of course in some ways, and this kind of has my son. So watch. You can see it. There he is, right? He's cut in to the archive.org video of duck and cover. Now, why does this mean anything to anyone? What's interesting is in 2005, I had my first kid. I built this website. I started downloading videos from archive.org that were open source, meaning public domain. I started mashing up videos of my kid into it. And about 3 months later, I got a job as an instructional technologist in Virginia, where I was actually asked to do the very things that I was doing for my kid's website. Use WordPress, host my own work, use media in different ways to kind of communicate and share. So it was interesting how this very personal vision of archiving became for me very quickly a profession for thinking about how this new order of tools, blogs, wikis, you name it, become a mechanism to share and build communities for people who maybe want to move outside of something like the learning management system. So it's funny to me how personal and small this all started. Where it gets interesting, I think, as a narrative is, I went to work with Gardner Campbell, who you met last week. And there were 4 other of us: Martha Burtis, Patrick Cassetti Murray John, Jerry Slazak, and Andy Rush. And the policy that we kind of built, which leads to the long question that Chris talked about with Reclaim, is we're going to support the LMS to the degree we have to. And when I say LMS, I mean Learning Management System, and it's usually things like Canvas or Blackboard or D2L, whatever. Kind of like transactional systems for submitting work, etc. The idea was, we'll support that to the degree we have to, but we also want you, as an instructional technologist, to get your own domain, your own web hosting, LAMP environment, which means you could install stuff like WordPress and MediaWiki, which runs Wikipedia, for students and faculty, and let them play with it. So it's kind of a dream job for me, because I had associated it with baby videos, and I loved doing it because it was all about pictures and digital media. So I was like, absolutely, I could convince anyone that this is awesome, because, you know, not too long before that, to make a website, you were usually using something like Microsoft Front Page or Dreamweaver. It was pretty difficult to wrap your head around FTP and stuff like that. So WordPress came around, and it was really simple to build a dynamic website. And once you started giving people a little bit of that crack cocaine, they were like, oh, wait, I can build a whole empire of my work with this simple publishing platform. So for the next 10 years, even up until today, I was really kind of convinced that WordPress was a mechanism to enable academics and students alike to publish, to share, to blog, and to build community through the open web. Very simple. Reclaim was a direct, in many ways, I don't know if it's a graduation of that, because it's just maybe a continuation would be a better way to say it, because web hosting, what we offer at Reclaim is nothing, it's not at all innovative. In fact, it's retro, like everything I do. Like shared hosting, which you all probably have to some degree, has been around since 2003, 2002, has been kind of commodity. So what happened is universities, when Web 2.0 came out, when I say Web 2.0, I mean like Flickr and Google Plus or Blogger, WordPress.com, all of these tools which made it easy, universities made a choice. They said, we're not going to actually even really, for the most part, engage that. We're going to keep the LMS, and we're going to let everyone do what they want, where they want, which in some ways could be good, right, for the freedom. In other ways, there was a lot of work that could have happened at universities that never got archived, never got shared. The questions of copyright came up, and Web 2.0 as a movement that was going to radically change higher ed never happened. I think that's fair to say. But at the same time, you know, 10 years later, I come in, we've been doing web hosting for years, and because the universities did not engage any of this, they're still in a position 10 years later where they have to provide some sort of decent web hosting and web services to their community. And so we basically provide universities web hosting, right? Like, so if faculty and students want to get their own domain and web hosting to install Omeka, which is an exhibit tool libraries use, or Moodle, which is kind of a learning management system open source, or WordPress, which I'm sure many of you are already using, it basically was a space that students could manage and control and own this. And at the end of their time, they take that domain and their work with them. This is something we pioneered at Mary Washington in 2012. Although to say pioneering seems weird, it's just not that pioneer. It's just that we brought it to higher ed, who was like, we don't do the web, right? And it kind of took off. 30 schools are doing it now, at least officially, institutionally, whereas hundreds are doing it in small kind of groups, departments, agencies, classes, and it's been a lot of fun. I cut my teeth on web hosting. Like Planet Miles was my first real experimentation with cPanel, building that site for my kid. And it has been the most rewarding playtime I've ever had in my life, because it's what I built an entire career on. And I'm not saying it's a good career. I'm not saying it's one that's enviable, but it provided a space for me to build and quote-unquote innovate, which is a dangerous word, around some of these tools to create senses of community. A couple of things we did along the way were UMW Blogs, which was a blogging platform for University of Mary Washington, which provided all students and faculty a place to share. And we used things called syndication, which should be an element of digital literacy everyone should think about, is how does you posting in one space, say your WordPress blog, automatically syndicate to another space where you can see everything. That was a really big push for us at Mary Washington. And it is at the point, I'm going to go into a little bit of a kind of nerdy distinction, but maybe it will be valuable. A blogging platform like the one we have at UMW Blogs was kind of like WordPress.com, right? You got a site, and the site would say jimgroom.wordpress.com, or it was jimgroom.umwblogs.org. A blogging platform like and that was actually kind of like WordPress.com, a nice thing. You got I love hearing myself twice. I sound twice as bad. So the actual idea there was you could get a site, but not have to worry about any of the overhead or administration or cPanel, right? It would just be done because you're working on someone else's instance. Whereas the big push for us was, let's not do it on someone else's instance. Let's ask every faculty and student to get their own web hosting, to install their own applications, to put in their own themes and plugins, and actually build out, call it a portfolio, call it a course site, call it a book you're creating, call it a website, call it a blog, call it whatever you want, but your space that you kind of trace, map, and narrate your learning over time, and then seamlessly take with it. The thing about WordPress is we got lucky, we gambled on the tool, I think we were right. 30% of the web now, as high as 30% of the web is driven by WordPress, which makes it, mammoth and a behemoth of the web. It also means that our faculty and students are using a tool that they will definitely use after they leave. So syndication in WordPress became essential to the work we're doing. And then this thing came around called DS-106. Digital storytelling. I know, Sarah, you said that you took a digital storytelling class. That's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. DS-106 was a class about digital storytelling with the assumption that I wasn't sure what it was. That was my basic assumption going into this class, is that the predefined idea that everybody had when they heard about digital storytelling was, okay, I'm going to do a 3-minute video about that bike ride I took with my mom and my dad, and then I fell off, and then they put me back on, and it was my favorite song behind, and then it was an iMovie with, the kind of that famous documentarian effect. Like, that was a digital story, and you saw these things produced, and it was like, is that a digital story? What about if your Facebook status update was a digital story, or that tweet you did, or the blog post you made, or the YouTube video? And what if that narrative was not so cohesive? What if that narrative was as decentered and kind of unobvious in some ways as the structure of the web? What if digital storytelling was in some ways a narrative accretion of yourself over time across this space? And the way in which you curate it is a story that you could potentially tell, but it's a story that could have so many portals in and out. So that class kind of morphed into this idea of every student getting their own domain, their own web hosting, and narrating their learning throughout the class. Like, you didn't matter how good your story was, didn't matter what you had to do is talk about your thinking. Why did you make this choice? Why did you build this? How did you do it? What were your influences? And over the course of 15 weeks, students would blog 200, 300 times, narrating their choices. And everything was a blog post, because at times me and another person, Alan Levine, did it, and we were major, like, we blogged too much. So we kind of pushed a lot of that on the students. But the idea was for them to inhabit this space. But by inhabiting their own space online, I was assuming, and I don't know if this was always correct, that they would also be interrogating it. And one of the great examples, and I'll stop here, is when we get to creating videos or creating music, because a lot of the assignments we created were actually created by students. So the assignment bank, which was designed by Martha Burtis, who I co-taught the class online for the first time with, is basically any student who wants to see an assignment go into the assignment bank could submit it. And if someone does your assignment, like, that's kind of a sign of pride, right? So one student, I'll give an example. Colleen was her name, Colleen Tracey, she was great. She submitted this assignment called the Poetry Playlist. And the idea behind this assignment was go into your iTunes playlist or whatever, music tool you use, it could be Spotify, whatever, and take from the titles that you have there and make a poem. So from the titles of the songs, you would turn it into a poem. And I thought this was the stupidest assignment. And when she put it in, I was like, she was the first one to put in an assignment. I was like, no one's going to do it. This is going to be a failure. And then a week later, 70 people from around the world had done her assignment, had created these poems. And for me, that was the proof of how the web works and her value within that ecosystem, a point of putting in, participating, and have other people build it. And that is DS-106. DS-106 is a student-driven, collaborative kind of workshop for creating on the web. You can create video, you can create audio, design, images, but all of it is about creating and narrating your creations over the course of 15 weeks. And the limitation of DS-106, a strength but also a limitation, is it's so focused on the individual's development over time. We broke that up a little bit with, and I know you all are doing group projects because I've seen that on the Twitter stream. We broke that up by bringing students together to create radio shows. So at week 4 and then again at week 7, they come together and they design and build a collaborative radio show. And these are by far the most impressive artifacts of not only them working together, building together, but also negotiating the idea of narrative individually and with 4 other people to create a compelling story. And it's funny because once the radio story is done, it actually, the work they did seeps into who they are as a creator in that class in their own blog. So I always think of the fact that we didn't have those group projects for the first 2 years, but really built them in the second, third, fourth, and fifth year, made a huge difference in the kind of composition of managing the individual versus the group in a kind of digital space. The last thing that they had to manage besides that was copyright. And I'll stop there because a lot of the assignments were like, make a collage of your favorite song or take a video and make an essay. So say your favorite movie is The Shining. Do an essay where you define elements of The Shining and you'll speak over the video or clips of the video to kind of make a point. They started doing these and uploading them to Vimeo and YouTube, and they were getting takedown notices, and there was this whole question of wait a second, I'm taking a 3-minute clip from Shining to talk about the uses of the psychology of space and this kind of very thoughtful voiceover, and YouTube is saying that I'm breaking copyright. And I'm not going to say I'm a lawyer, but it brought to the fore, in terms of discussion, such interesting kind of points about, well, what if I couldn't quote 2 passages from Shakespeare or, a Faulkner passage or something from Beloved? How can we not quote the TVs, the films, the songs that define our culture in a critical way as part of an educational experience? And for me, this really was brought to light in interesting ways when these students were trying to actually interact and critique their culture. YouTube, as this kind of weird arbiter of copyright, was taking it all down or was shutting down the sound. And it was like, how did we get into a cultural moment where we have an advertising company telling us what we can and cannot talk about critically in the classroom? And so that's always, for me, is the epiphany. And I don't even have to build that moment anymore. It's students understand it. They've been trying to make, cultural artifacts of their moment for years, and they know the limits of it. They know how much of that is limited. And they go to places like Tumblr and other places to hide from it. But once they're bought by Yahoo, that all changes. So there's almost this whack-a-mole notion of, and so we got to the point of how do you kind of not fight copyright, or how do you go fight it? You're not going to win. How do you just kind of stay away from them? Like, how do you get under the radar? And so there's an interesting kind of like guerrilla nature to the last 2 or 3 weeks of DS-106, because we're just trying to talk about our culture, and we're coming up with critical ways of doing that. And I just think that's such a lesson in like the nature of creation and of critique in our day and age. So much of it depends upon remix and mashup, yet that's the very thing that various companies and governments and lobbyists are trying to shut down. And I really think there's an interesting discussion there. The other thing is gifts, but we could talk about that separately. Because I could talk forever, as you can see. Like, I'm just getting started. It's like,
yeah. So let me break in here, because I have at least a dozen places we could take this. But let me throw it out to the students first, and what you've heard on any of these topics, ranging from the idea of owning your own domain and reclaim, and some of you are teachers at various levels and how that might apply, all the way through to kind of copyright and the idea of, it's almost like, I mentioned this somewhere else, that you know how they have that search, evade, what is that training you get in the military, SEER training? They need SEER training for people who want to exercise their right to free expression in the system of copyright we have. So any of you have questions or thoughts on that you want to bring out right now? It's your time.
Don't let me go unchecked. Be careful.
I think one thing when I'm talking to faculty about fair use is, like, you got to exercise your right and do it, and don't be afraid, and you have rights as an educator. You students have rights to use their. And I think we all just need to continue doing it and pushing and pushing. I don't know what the solution is, but I agree. I think as faculty and as students of education, you just need to keep pushing and keep trying and finding those guerrilla places where you can share.
And I want to, so let me tag on to that and ask you, Jim, because like there's a, and you can do both of these at the same time, but there are two philosophies about this, right? One is kind of like you said, you can find the different places and colonize there while they're more free. But in the end, most of the time, we're actually talking about things that, if you are able to find a way to push back, are fair use. I mean, the things that were being taken down are legitimately fair use by pretty much any criteria. The problem is you're not adjudicated by a person, but by a machine. So I know you have some experience, for instance, with YouTube and trying to deal with the takedowns. And so, what has your experience been doing that and fighting that fight, and is it even worth it? Because part of what I try to convey to students in the copyright section is that fair use is a pretty broad right. It's just not adjudicated as one because it never even reaches that point. You get a takedown notice, or you get a scary letter and you think, oh, I must be in the wrong, often by people who don't even own the copyright that they're trying to enforce. So how do you work in that space without it still exercise the agency that Heidi's talking about?
Yeah, it's and you say it very well. Let me start by saying, hi, my name is Jim, and I'm a pirate, right? So that's how I feel. So I spent the first 6 years of my time doing the stuff I talked about with Planet Miles, but then getting even more bold and taking clips from films I love and then integrating them into my blog for critiques, or doing voiceovers, or taking pieces of Dawn of the Dead and mashing that up against the 1950s mall video to talk about the ways in which consumerism, so just really using the media to talk about it. And about, I don't know how many years ago now, 5 years ago, YouTube came to me and they said, look, we're getting a lot of, claims on your videos. So what happens is, and this is weird, and I should do more research, companies from around the world make claims on videos, and they don't necessarily want to take them down. They want to put ads on top of them and collect money for the ads. And so what I was doing is I was saying, no, you can't. I'm going to fight. So I fought every claim of ownership that came to any of my videos. Every one. I got like 50 or 100 of them. I fought them all. And ultimately, not those people who were claiming ownership, but Google told me, and like Chris, you said, in a robotic form letter, that I was basically fighting too many of the claims that, according to Google, I was losing, although there was no adjudication, and that they were going to delete my YouTube account, which had a couple of million views of stupid videos that I don't necessarily, it's not like I sit daily and mourn them because I can reproduce them. But at the same time, it was strange to me that there was no ever me sitting in front of a tribunal. Like, it wasn't even Kafkaesque. Like, there was no tribunal at all. It was just like, here's your letter. It's over. We deleted all your work. No warning, no anything. And I thought I was going through due process, and I was making this as a kind of exercise as we were doing DS 106 to say, you know, I think we should fight these. And I was telling students, like, you know, I'm not saying go to court, but like, if you think it's fair use, say it. Thing is fair use is a defense, right? It's not an actual, like, it's nothing to stand on. So fair use would only be of value if they actually tried to sue me, right? And they never wanted to get there. So Google has played this really bizarre role of, and it's a role that really helps their business model, that actually prevents people from sharing copyrighted material, not because we have, you know, foundational claims on it, not to say there aren't foundational claims, because I'm sure, but it never gets to that point because Google doesn't let it. And Google does push people to X amount of videos that do have their advertising. They actually map that on top of it, so when you search it, you'll find one that gets them more money. And it just, to me, it just seemed like a racket, right? It's like what TV promised to be in the 50s and 60s, and YouTube quickly became a kind of, you know, just kind of inside network racket where I really don't even feel, I use it to search for stuff and find stuff, but I'll never put another video on YouTube because I feel like it was a completely unilateral relationship to power and our culture that I was never a part of the equation. And not to say that YouTube's going to be like, oh, Jimmy, you were such a good YouTuber. We are going to give it back. Like, not even that, but it just seems like this is, why am I doing it in someone else's garden, right? Why am I doing this and not thinking broadly about the web can never work if it's unified into a monolithic power like Google, at least work the way we'd want it to. So that for me was kind of a wake-up call that I have to be more thoughtful and vigilant about my own archiving. I have to be more thoughtful and vigilant about managing my own stuff to the degree I can. The problem with video is hard to serve quickly, and people won't find it if it's not on Vimeo or YouTube. So I don't want to say I gave up that fight. I follow people who are doing the fight, but it always ends the same. There's no person involved. There's no court. It's just you've been suspended. And that suspension also has an implication for the actual, how would I say it, the integrity of the archive of so many sites. Right? Because so many people have counted on YouTube, have embedded YouTube, have used that as part of their discourse. And go back, the probably most inconsistent element of my site, 10-year archive, is YouTube links. Because they are constantly either changing the API or just deleting people's accounts. So it's an interesting trail of tears when you think about it, and it's all happening under this guise of them as this kind of neutral arbiter who just has to do it because there's pressure from these media companies, which it's all behind closed doors. Like, there's no evidence of that. But that's absolutely what happens when you get into bed with these companies. I mean, that's right. The lesson for me is like, that's what happens. Like, you go to Flickr, you go to Google, you go to Facebook, and everything's great, and all your friends are there, and everything's fine, and then it's not. Like, then they make a unilateral decision about your digital archive, about your footprint, about your identity that you don't like, and you have no control over that. Catfishing is a really good example. You guys should get Koros or Alan.
We're going to have Alan week after next, still figuring out the time, so that'll be certainly a good one. But, you know, that really brings up the idea, you know, there's obviously the philosophies of copyright and fair use and how it fits or not the age that we're in. And I know Martha has a lot of experience in dealing with, I think, on both sides of the issue. She's an educator who wants to exert her freedom of expression and pioneer in different ways and explore, and yet it also has to represent an interest that whose livelihood depends on copyright. And I'm not on the side that says we shouldn't have any copyright. I'm more on the side that says it's kind of a stale fiction at this point that needs to be replaced with something better. I don't know that that's going to happen. But the other thing in what you just said that strikes me is about, you know, you started out talking about reclaim your domain and create, you know, that transition to owning your stuff. So as I've talked with Darcy Norman about on Twitter and being digital sharecroppers and things, I mean, in that ultimate vision, you wouldn't want to do any of that anyway. I mean, why would you even want to be on YouTube or Flickr or anything else? Because you should be putting that all on your domain. But I also understand that these mammoth players in the industry are where you get the attention, and not just in an ego way, but in any way to get your word out. So you kind of get caught in the middle. So, you know, I'm kind of curious now that everybody in this class has their domain. I mean, that's one of the things that this class does. It's kind of the mini, you know, have your own domain. You have to in the Own It program. And they can take it with them if they choose to. Sadly, many don't choose to, I've discovered. They just disappear. But, you know, how do you find that balance? And how do you know, deal with the need? I mean, if you don't use Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Flickr to some degree, you're cutting off an entire, very large part of an audience. You know, so I can build all the stuff I want inside my cubby and inside my bomb shelter and inside my cellar, but how do I connect?
Yeah. So, interesting. I mean, 2 points there. And Linnea, I'm going to get to your point because I do like that, and I want to come back to that. That, for me, is a striking moment. But for me, you do want to go to these public places, right? I think Alan Levine says this, like, yeah, I want to, you know, do my work in my house, but I want to go out and see a movie theater, go to a movie and see a movie in the public, or go to a barn dance and dance with people. Like, Flickr might be that, YouTube might be that. And I could see that. Like, I put stuff on Flickr, I put stuff on Twitter. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, more than I probably should, even as it gets less and less interesting and more univocal and more blindered. I'm still there because that's where other people are. People probably do the same thing with Facebook and all these places. So I think we all do that because we want to be with other people. For me, the point becomes, and it's kind of goes back to the beginning, is I started my online kind of experimentation as an archive of my son's life, and then an archive of my own thinking and work, and then an archive of all the stuff I'm interested in. And I want other people to read that. I want other people to share. I don't want to just do it in a vacuum, right? But there's this kind of this movement, call it a movement, I don't know if it's as big as a movement, called the indie web. And one of the things the indie web kind of suggests, and I like this, is, look, all those social media silos are fine. But like Linnea puts up, like, they change something and you have so much of your identity there. They control that far more than you do. And that's something that we should be mindful of. That should be an element of digital literacy, right? Like, what do we own? What do we control? What is temporary? What does longevity mean? Is there a digital presence after we're gone? Like, questions that I think are trippy and interesting because I've spent so much time in this space. But the other point for me is, you know, how do you, as you're doing this work, push it out to all those places like Flickr, YouTube, Facebook, but also keep your own archival copy on your own domain? They call this, the indie web calls this posse. So publish on your own site and syndicate everywhere. And Chris, I saw on the hashtag you were talking about things like if this and that, and other tools that allow you to publish, say, to your blog. Like, say, for example, you publish to your blog, your domain, And then that also went to a link to Facebook or to Twitter or to Flickr or wherever you wanted that image or text to be, or to Medium, which I hate. Like, I hate Medium. I hate the whole concept of Medium. Medium drives me crazy. It's the death of the web. But people go there because people read it. And for me, the idea would be, okay, I'm going to sit on my horse on all sorts of topics, but I do think that even if we started with students or faculty, like, own your archival version of the work you do, but then push it wherever you want. And think of this as a kind of like, as an individual, I control and manage this across various spaces, and then push it to where I know other people are. That's a powerful idea. It's tools like Known get us halfway there. But the other half that we haven't gotten to is, to do that, you need to have a sophisticated integrated reader that allows you to see everyone and what they're doing in Twitter and what they're doing in Facebook, so that you can feel connected and yet still push it through your own systems and then out. That's something I would love to see built. That's something I dream of. I'm just too stupid to do anything like that. But I do think that there is a lot of hope for me in managing and controlling your archival version of stuff and then pushing it out to these other silos, so that when they go away, and when we talk about silos, they mean Facebook, which has their own policy, own privacy, own IP, all of that. They mean Flickr. All of these centralized systems, right? They mean Google. And so they may last for as long as we live, right? Although when you think about 25 years in the web, we were saying that about a lot of things. Like, GeoCities isn't going anywhere. Right? And GeoCities was, systematically deleted by Yahoo. It wasn't even like retired. It was deleted. There was like 5 people all over the world who saved GeoCities. Think about that. You have a mammoth billion-dollar corporation at Yahoo that decided to turn off the server and delete it. And 5 individuals who are called the archive team saved it. That's how lopsided our understanding of the history of the web is. And I worry that the more faith we put into companies like Facebook, Twitter, Google, Apple, you name them. I mean, there's no one. There's many. And they're not evil. They just smell funny. And the idea is like, where are you in this? Like, agency starts with your relationship to the work you do. And for me, the domain was always the simplest way to build agency and empowerment. And it's cheap, and it travels. And so it just, to me, seemed a no-brainer, even though it's not maybe the coolest house on the street like Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Like, it's the creepy treehouse that your own professor coined. And he jokes about that, but that's a very powerful metaphor. And the more time goes by, the more powerful it becomes, as we see them become more and more craggly and closed with the thorns, and you can't get out. Like, it's like that slow process.
Well, and that ties directly to Linnea's question, and I think the larger question too of kind of your presentation, as she puts it, being owned by some corporation. And I would welcome that future where the indie web works. What I worry about is that right now we're able to publish once and syndicate to other places with some facility, but more and more all those places that we would want to go to are locking it down. So you have corporate ownership of your identity in some ways that's slowly locking down so that you can't even connect the dots anymore. I mean, how this goes back to syndication and RSS and all that early work that we both were doing a long time ago.
It's funny, too. It is. And it's all that. And RSS disappeared, which was like one of the most open formats. Was basically Medium just put RSS back in, which is bizarre. But someone on the hashtag mentioned the current idea that the customs office in the U.S. will actually be asking you for your social media handles. I don't know who did it. One of you had mentioned that, which I thought was brilliant. Think about that. Like, think about the social media handles that we think of as fun 10 years ago, and like, I want to get a Facebook account. Like, this is the single definer besides your passport that governments are using to identify, judge, and potentially track you. Now, This is not me being a weird conspiracy theorist in the mountains of Italy saying the government's watching you, right? Like, it's established. There's a guy, Snowden, on Twitter who basically, we live in a post-Snowden era in some ways, right? We know this is happening. And I'm fascinated by that. Like, I'm fascinated by that. And I'm not I'm not a black helicopter person, like, here they come, right? But, like, they are tracking us daily. And that happens more and more in relationship to the systems we occupy. And so there's a very simple question about basic freedoms when you start thinking about it. And I never go there when I'm having conversations with people because I want them to think I'm relatively intelligent, nice, and not feel like, who's this weird person talking about individual freedom in their domain? I don't want to get there. Like, I don't consider myself a crackpot. But when you think about your profile on the web and how the entire economies of countries are about analytically datafying and commodifying everything you do, that's a question mark. Like, I would want to be critically prepared by an institution or a university or someone to think about that. Because I think that, for me, however, like, and I agree, Chris, I mean, I'm not sitting here saying IP is a bad thing or copyright, but I do think that informed citizens that understand how some basic digital infrastructures work and the production of that system works is crucial to an informed population. And I'm even more scared just by, like, the Trump thing and being on Twitter. And the Brexit thing. Like, you have no sense of what people are really thinking. It's a complete bubble. And I'm really got a little bit freaked out after Brexit, and I hope I'm not freaked out after Trump, but it's a very weird moment. Wherever you sit politically, like, there just seems to be everything is completely polarized.
Well, and it ties to something I talked about at the beginning of this class or have shared in terms of people establishing their domain. Is I don't think we're in a time where the no choice is a really valid option. And I think that leads to a lot of what we're seeing. It isn't so much just the polarization, it's the big belly where there's just no choice being made. And so it's being guided by extreme ends of the poles. And so when it comes to this kind of idea of agency, there's the practical question that the fact is, if you apply for a job or you're connecting with people in just about any way, I mean, that's the real practicality of this, they're going to look for you. And you're either going to have a presence somewhere in this corporatized media, or you might have, if you're fortunate, have built something that will be findable and discoverable outside of that. But what you can't do is not exist, because that kind of attempt to live off the grid from the the internet community, that it just isn't going to work for most people at this point. So that's a real part of this agency question to me, because we have a lot of people who adopt various levels of privacy and they don't want to use lots of different systems, and I get that. But the alternative can't be nothing. I just don't think that's a good way to go. And so that leads again to that question of ownership. So what I see, what you've done, what people like Alan, the people that I think are, what's interesting to me is, yeah, you publish in these various places, but in the end you've built a presence of your own that stands when the other things crumble. And if you were applying for a job with e-learning, God help you, I would be Googling your name to see, who are you and where are you at? And if you just don't exist, that's a suspicious character nowadays.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating balance there.
And this is cool because two things here. Like, I've been talking a lot about owning domain, and Linnea is another great question. Like, so $35 or $25 or $12, do you own your domain name? Does Reclaim own it? Actually, we don't own it, and you don't own it. You lease it. So you lease it for a year from a registrar. And this is something that I'm interested in, and I saw a really great talk by a guy named Vint Cerf, who actually can literally say I invented the internet, right? Like, he's one of the pioneers of the internet. He gave this talk at the Internet Archive where he was talking about the DNS system, and when he's talking about that, it's basically the name system, the domain naming system, is, as it is right now, a little bit broken, meaning that it's become this corporate entity that sells you a domain for X amount of time, and how long you can manage that domain, you can buy it like 10 years out. And so one of the things he's proposing, and I love, and this is link to a bigger vision I think we would be really fortunate to start to introduce for the next generations is a digital namespace that we manage in perpetuity. So you would get Linnea Sara dot whatever forever. And that would be everything you do, private, public, otherwise, would happen there. You could push it out, so that could be the place from which you push stuff out. But that is your digital lineage. That is your digital domain that lasts. And it's like your social security number or something like that, but it's unique and it lives. And just think about what that would do. Assuming that the stuff is public on there that you want to be public on there, for the integrity of the history of the web. The DNS, the major problem with it is because it's based on this $8 a year thing is at the point you don't want to pay that anymore, Linnea, it goes away, and often that means everything you produce does too. If we think of the internet as a utility, which I do, we need to think of the web as even a kind of feature of that utility and try and build in ways that preserve it. And Vince Cerf was giving this amazing talk about the self-archiving web. And the idea was every person at birth would get a perpetual domain. And they could map stuff on top of it. So like you could say linneasudduth.com lives on that for 10 years, and you pay $120 and then it goes away. But underneath that is the existing perpetual domain. And I'm tripped out about that because my interest in the web really comes back to an interest in archiving the thought and the way in which people trace that thought. And if we have such a fragile system that could be easily fixed, why don't we?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to think about that too, just in terms of overcoming that theoretical divide in citizenship and place and geographical location and virtual location. And you tie that to wearables and Internet of Things, and I mean, suddenly you see this vision. It's like that sci-fi vision of what might be coming for our children or grandchildren in that sense. But having that identity claimed out when you're born is fascinating. I know some people have to drop off. I don't know if you can stay a little longer, Jim. We can pursue a couple of these threads. But one thing that struck me also that you're talking about in all of this and from the beginning to the end is, and I know it's a practical matter for students who will be watching this or are here now, how does this vision extend back into younger and younger kids? And has your kind of view changed at all with all the discussions and controversy about social media representations and existence online for children that's controlled by parents or teachers? Would a domain of their own for third graders, what does that mean even? Is that something that's a good thing?
Yeah. I mean, I personally think, here's what I would think. Like, even if that's managed with the parents or by the parents, like, we give a kid certain things as a matter of course for expediency, right? Like the social security number, they get that for maybe health issues, or, here we have, in Italy where I am now, we have a fiscal code, which you need to get health care. So the idea for me would be, I'm not saying every kid's got to be online with their own domain, but if we had a national domain, let's call it like that everyone got at birth, and my daughter was starting to do stuff that I was scanning or she was scanning and putting there, not online, but in her repository. How cool would that be? Like pictures that I were taking that I was pushing so she would have them and I wouldn't have to worry about that. Like, so I think of it more not about necessarily having to be public, but having a workflow for the media we produce that works. And this to me is huge because everyone here, I think, has probably thousands of digital images, maybe hundreds of videos, maybe thousands, text documents that define who they are and the work they've done. And right now, our archiving system is like, I hope my Mac doesn't go, and I hope my backup drive works. But what if we had a sophisticated kind of repository for this stuff that we kind of built on? And I really believe that it doesn't have to be about always being public, but it does have to be about thinking very early on about being a responsible digital archivist. Because as Yahoo taught us with GeoCities, no one else is going to save your stuff but you. And so
So
I
the
would think,
graduation ceremony is getting your keys to that domain, that archive that's been building over time, and probably through the wearables, it's automatic 24/7 video of you and everything you've been doing with your retinal camera
exactly.
eventually, and you get it, and you get
And
to
it
do what
will,
you want with it.
you can think of it kind of like Dropbox. Like Dropbox kind of goes there, although again, it's a corporate entity that manages that. That might not always be a bad thing. But like we have visions of it already, of managing all these documents and managing all these items. And then there's bigger questions about managing the conversations we've had, forum threads, relationships like this, you know, when you're in with people, like who manages this? Like whose YouTube account is it? Like, could I get a copy? Why wouldn't I be able to get a copy of something I was a part of? Same thing goes for all the students' work they've done at a university or in grade school for 12 years, right? Like, where is our ability to get access to the work we do? And I think to me, more than copyright or any of that, like basic access to the work we're asked to do as part of these institutions would be a start. And not just education, insurance, dental, medical, energy, all of these things. This is data that we're constantly building and creating that other people control and sell and manage, yet we have no access to it in the way we've organized it. And this goes to a bigger thing about the idea of, rather than making the institution the center of all of this kind of systematizing, make the individual in control of their work, and they decide what they share with that institution or with that school or with that doctor, right? Like, what if we had control of data so that when a doctor wanted access to our records, we gave them access rather than us begging for it from them?
Well, and this needs to be tied to true decentralization. Otherwise, it's a terrifying kind of fascist future of, you know, we just simply have the corporate behemoth at the center that actually owns everything from birth, as it already does many other aspects of our identity in some ways, right? I mean,
and it kind of is already. Like, if that's the fascist future, we're far closer to that than the opposite.
So I also want to extend this to that idea of, because I know we've had this discussion, and I think I tend to be a person, let me phrase this another way. How do you feel about the right to self-erasure and to not just taking something, turning something off that you have made, but actually essentially deleting it from the history of the web that is us? Because that to me is the other side of this coin, right? Is the ephemerality, ability to have ephemerality and to have things that are temporary. And yet I have a mixed mind about it. It drives me insane when I think about Europe's provisions where you can actually get all of these things removed out of Google. Like, you can just take links out of there even though they exist. Like, my mind balks at that. And at the same time, I'm constantly burning stuff down. If I get too many people reading what I'm doing or too many Twitter followers, I ditch the account and I start again. You've seen this many times.
I have.
How do you handle that in this future? And what does that work with identity as well?
Yeah,
and you and Linnea happens naturally.
You and Linnea are on parallel paths, because that was her question too. And, you know, I think that's, again, like, I like that option is up to the individual. Like, I may want to keep everything online. Like, maybe I'm an egoist, right? And I want it all out there, right? Like, I'm what would you call it? Like a digital exhibitionist. And then maybe there are people who don't. And I think that would be, so the control panel I see, or like the dashboard I see, is like, for you, Linnea, to go in there and be able to say, like, you know what? I don't want that image online anymore. I don't want this online. I want this to go away. I want this posed. And you're curating that. And I can testify to the fact that once you delete stuff, it does stay around for a little bit, but it doesn't stay online forever. I've lost stuff, and I cannot find it, and I've spent time looking for it, stuff I didn't necessarily want to lose. So I think the myth of it's always around forever, you know, maybe someone will dig it up in some dark archive if you're running for president. But other than that, I bet most of it's going to be gone. So I'm not so worried about the ephemeral. I think the ephemeral is going to happen anyway. I think there's a lot that's going to be lost. And I think if you want it to be lost, you can do that easily.
But in this idea of the decentralized kind of environment, it's not just, you're not just deleting it for you, you're deleting it for everybody. And there's like a web of interconnections and communication. And what frustrates me most is not the stuff disappears, because I 100% agree with you. Like, you can't find I mean, even the stuff I haven't intentionally deleted, you can't find it. I mean, like you said, if I'm running for president, maybe somebody will dig it out, but you're not going to find it. This stuff just disappears.
Yeah.
But what's happened and what I find is I was just doing this yesterday. I was tracing back some threads from OpenEd 2009 and comments and realized that when I had deleted a bunch of things, I was affecting an entire web of connections and communication. And so I had a different sense of responsibility to that. Because the ephemeral that happens naturally with us is I'm talking to you in the cafe and we leave and the conversation's done. But this is, you know, it's still there. So I think we have different, at least, obligations to think about, even if we don't feel, you know, totally pursuant to them, I guess.
Yeah, I don't disagree. So here's something I do, and this may be, like, this would raise ethical questions, right? So one of the things I do on my blog, the Berkman Center at Harvard, I think it is, they put out a tool called Amber. And so what this tool does is it goes through all my links, like the Internet Archive, and it screenshots all the pages. So it screenshots and it takes HTML scrapes to them. So even if Chris were to delete his site, as he did several times, I could actually have a copy of it on my server and serve it. Now, probably not from that domain, but someone could come to my site and read it. I think that's great. Because I'm actually preserving a link that I imagine Chris didn't really want to break. He just didn't renew his domain because he couldn't afford the $11.99 that he was supposed to pay.
I know, man. When domains went up to $15, I was out. No, but it also makes me think about, you know, Mike Caulfield and FedWiki and just different ideas of thinking of how we're bringing content together when we make these links. I mean, the typical way that people pursue this, and I see this in the class and I do it too, is, you know, I'll be blogging and I'll make a link to your blog and I'll basically have my thoughts about it. But I'm not actually archiving your page inside mine. I'm not bringing in or forking the content or anything, because that's just a second-level consideration. But if we are thinking about this future and thinking about the ideas of deletion and movement, then maybe those ideas of even how we write for the web and how we refer so that they don't get lost, and then also how these new technologies. I'm fascinated and totally mystified by FedWiki stuff, and I'm still trying to figure out. But I see the vision of what he's trying to get to. So that's
totally.
Another interesting way to go.
But I think, too, here, like let's say, for example, the next class I'd want to teach, like the digital storytelling class was DS-106. I think the next one I'd want to teach would be digital archiving. And the concept would be to understand how something like the Wayback Machine works. I mean, Alan Levine, who I brought up a few times, just posted that, you know, they don't actually scrape your site by default. You actually have to tell them to. And so this idea that it's always going to be there and this big machine watching, I think that's, again, part of the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that's informing that. But I imagine that if many people use the web to share over the course of time, you still have to give them the choice to at some point take it down. And it could be in the decentralized web still show up, and that to me is kind of like the other side of openness, right? Like, openness can be a great thing and a beautiful thing, but then at the point where you don't want everything out there anymore and you change your mind, some of it will be. I don't think that it will last forever. I think it will go away. But I don't know. Like, I'm of the mindset, like, for me, like I said at the beginning, this is so much about an archivist journey for me. And more as I get older and older, that's all it's about. I'm already, like, just digging in. I kind of want to feel like I can preserve a sense of the work I've done over time on the digital, and it's not just like career work. It's just like stupid stuff with my kids, with my family, like the cats we got, like a small, like almost like a scrapbook with links, right? Like,
right.
That's what I think about it.
That's why it's interesting to me, because for one, it has a practical effect on how I think about when I'm writing on the web, and so I tend to include more context of my own and not rely just on the fragility of the link to get there to see what I'm talking about. So there's that. And then there's the underlying vision of what Mike Caulfield is talking about with FedWiki, where it kind of automates the process of forking that content so that you have it, even if it goes away, but you still have a link back to the original. You know, it's that original underlying idea of the web with Ted Nelson and Xanadu and original hyperlinks, right, where the content flows in both directions. But that also ties to the questions that are happening, the conversation happening in the text chat about, you know, do I really own my content if you can capture it and do things with it. I think DRC, who's just joined us, who is at University of Alaska Anchorage, and she's an instructional design librarian, I believe. She'll correct me if that's wrong. Has a lot of interest in this and the permanence or not of things on the web. And so the question of ownership, it's a whole. This is why the idea of intellectual property is so broken right now, is because the idea of ownership and virtual things, it's not just that you could always copy pages from a book. It's the ease with which you can make duplicates. It's the ease with which you can distribute them that changes the picture, right? So yeah, we could always copy Martha's book pages, mimeograph them, or have our scribes copy them and illuminate the manuscripts for us, whatever. But it's a little different when I can just copy and paste and drop it off to you right now. So that affects the idea of ownership and transfer.
There's an interesting doubleness going on there too, right? Like, so Darcy's bringing up the point, and so is Martha, and Linnea too now, is, we get into this moment where when you bought a book, you owned it, and by owning the book, you actually could lend it to other people, right? Like, you could actually share it. But when it became digital, you couldn't share it anymore, right? The ability to share actually stopped. And that's an interesting doubleness. Tess?
Yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating thing that in this world of easy duplication, the DRM and other controls on content for ebooks and ebook readers has made that, I won't say impossible, and I won't say I have experiences, but I've heard from other people that can be broken, but it's much more difficult than to actually just lend a book to somebody.
Yeah, and Scott Leslie just wrote a great post about libraries and the way in which you would think that with the digital, it would open up all sorts of possibilities for libraries to lend. But lending depended upon this idea of the physical, not on the digital, because digital was reproducible, and hence the whole point about copyright that you brought up is just fundamentally at odds with the infrastructure we have.
Yeah, it's also broken just in simple terms because when it's easier to pirate a book than it is to go through all the machinations to actually get the book legally when you're willing to, which is a real problem that I see with library access. Like, I need to install this Overdrive app that uses this thing that I can't integrate with anything else. And when I can go with 2 clicks and get the book elsewhere, I'm not saying I've done that for the record, but if I wanted to, you could, right? So that the whole technology is broken around trying to pretend that these virtual copies are the same as physical copies. It's just a bizarre situation to me. DRC is saying libraries deal with this all the time. Do you want to chime in there, DRC?
Are you able to hear me? Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, I'm not very heavily involved with that aspect of librarianship, but certainly working in libraries, we have these conversations all the time. And when we moved to the digital age, it created so many new problems. For one, we license. Like, you don't actually own hardly any of the library materials that you purchase as a library. You license it. So what happens when right now we have huge budget cuts and we've paid massive amounts of money for these materials over the years, and we have to cancel the subscription, so we lose access to all of it. And then this idea of interlibrary loaning. We've done interlibrary loan, I don't know how long it's been, but for virtually ever, certainly in our lifetimes. Libraries have shared books with each other so that the library patrons can get them. But when you have an ebook, there's no interlibrary loan. And we run into this problem also, like University of Alaska Southeast. We share a catalog with much of Alaska. And University of Alaska Southeast got this great package, this great ebook package. Shows up in our catalog. Our students run into it, and they're like, oh, great, I need this book. Oh, okay, well, sorry. We don't have it here. We can't give you access to that book even though it's in our catalog. You can't just click into it. There's not like a pay-per model where we just pitch in a couple bucks and we get it. We just don't have access. So then we're interlibrary loaning it from the lower 48 to try to get a print copy. And yeah, it's a nightmare. And things have gotten slightly better. In recent years, I know that there's been some progress in getting some better deals with digital stuff and stuff like that, as opposed to when it very first started. But it creates so many problems, and it just costs so much money to provide access to things that were easy before. You just buy your $50 book, and you've got it for the next 20 years, and you can send it out wherever you want.
So I know from chat, but I was sure already Martha might have some things to say about this, coming with her perspective from the publisher's angle.
Yeah, so on the point of licensing instead of owning, from the publisher side of the house, when we create a book, a print book, I license content for that print book. And when I buy the license to that content, for example, this morning I bought access to Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream. I have to pay his family foundation for that. And in the licensing contract for that content to go into print and digital, I am buying it by the print copies as well as the length of license. And I pay against that. And they audit me back against that. So when the model changed from print, where it was very easy for me to say I'm printing 10,000 copies, when I get ready to go back to press, I've got to re-up my license in order to stay out of court and paying millions of dollars in fines. It became extremely complicated when you look at an ebook. How do I pay the estate what they're due? How do I audit that on my end? And how do I still deliver something that's economical to the end user? So it's a big mashup of change of times, not keeping up with the traditional process of how we license content. At the same time, with the ease to which you can take something digital and spin it out across the globe, as a rights holder, they can very quickly lose the one piece that's generating revenue for them. Not the company, not the publishing company, but the original rights holder. And that applies to everything from text to images. So all of this compounds and everyone's looking after their interest. And you're seeing some of this shake loose a little bit. I used to have to pay millions of dollars to get global rights, and anything that I put on the web needs to have global rights. It can't be North American rights, for example. Well, some of those fees have started to shrink, making it more economical, and it's going to allow us to change some of those models going forward as some of the back-end licensing and permissions pieces change and catch up with technology.
Yeah, it's an interesting evolution that way. I think, DRC, have you seen prices or the prices for access, or do you know of going down when it comes to, say, library databases and journals? I mean, I know, say, Elsevier or whatever is certainly not going down in price, but maybe others are.
My opinion, again, as I'm a semi-outsider because I'm not part of these conversations, but I do hear my colleagues talking, is that the pricing of like journals or ebook packages seems incredibly arbitrary. And I say that because as we are having these massive budget cuts and we're calling these companies and saying, look, we can't afford to have you anymore, suddenly we're getting 75% off. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. So you're charging all of these libraries different amounts, and I really feel like we should just get together and start publishing and saying, this is what we're paying per FTE, and this is what you're paying for FTE, and getting together and saying, hey guys, no. You know what I mean? So my impression is that I'm sure there's some minimum number that they need, but really they will get everything out of you that they possibly can, is my impression.
Well, there is a lot of arbitrariness to it because, I mean, in the end, while there's many different levels of labor that can go into production, we're still talking about a shift in mindset from, scarcity to abundance. And, as people in the class, students in the class, you'll be reading some from Yochai Benkler's Wealth of Networks and some other things that talk about this idea of transition into the culture of abundance. But there's a lot of arbitrariness to this pricing because you are still, in the end, talking about a virtual product that has a lot less ties to the physical aspects of production. So I know it's not totally arbitrary, and I have a lot of sympathy for the position that says, look what's happened with journalism and investigative journalism, and what's our obligation to support the people who are doing the on-the-ground work to make these things happen, making a good textbook, making good materials that all the professors want to go with the textbook, because nobody just wants a textbook anymore. They want the whole virtual aspect that goes with it. That takes time and money by people. So from that perspective, it's certainly reasonable to figure out who pays these costs, but it's also the calculation of what those costs are. And then there's the other side you mentioned, which is both the consumers banding together to say, look, this is the pricing that we are able and willing and wanting to pay. But there's also the aspect of just opting out of it completely through, what do they call the standard of OER with journals? Gold standard OERs. I can't keep track of them all, but like, true open publishing and true open resources, and maybe some ideas that maybe copyright doesn't need to last for 105 years or 80 years. Maybe that's not a reasonable thing to think about in terms of where we're at today with virtual intellectual property and IP. There's modification of the system as possible too. So there's certainly a lot of directions you can go, I think, in trying to challenge this, work around this, as Jim was talking about, or engage with people like the publishers Martha works with, or anybody else to try to find some kind of balance. But I have my own feelings about where copyright certainly is at legislatively and what needs to change. I just don't have a lot of hope of changing it.
Yeah, and I personally, I mean, the copyright thing for me, if I take that back to like universities and the systems we use currently, one of the things that I'm interested in is this conversation is not even really happening. The LMS has become a useful tool to hide. It's almost like a copyright harbor, right? People just put it in the LMS, share it with their students. No one talks about it, right? Like the don't ask, don't tell policy of copyright. And so a class like we taught it with DS-106 brought that out. And a huge part of the class conversation was about copyright, but not copyright theoretically. Copyright in relationship to where does pushing back on I agree, like publishers got to get paid to publish. There's got to be models of support. Journalism is a perfect example of where that's broken. You can't support good journalism at the same point of not having revenue, right? So there is an issue there. But like when it comes to academics, which is basically our focus, at least as instructional technologists in higher ed, like this is a gold mine for thinking critically about what parts of our culture we can share and what parts we can't. And these are supposed to be the institutions that can safely push back on these. And that's what maybe worries me most, is I was at an institution for 10 years and there was never a conversation about it beyond the stuff we're doing at EdTech, and we're not lawyers. And, everybody was afraid. Like, it wasn't about a conversation. It was about open discussion, dialogue. Like, people just were afraid for the very reasons of they don't want to be on the other side of a lawsuit. Even though, I don't know, when was the last fair use lawsuit? It doesn't exist. So it's like this bizarre specter that higher ed, the intellectual kind of capital of our country has completely run away from. And I think that has implications for our future if we keep up that path. I do.
Well, and certainly at the institutional level, I mean, one of the paradoxes here for me, and I'll invoke Martha here, because in creating, the institution doesn't engage in this question because they aren't engaged in questions of critical pedagogy, right? So Martha creates rich products and works on creating textbooks with all kinds of great materials that you can use in place of, most often, it doesn't have to be this way, but most often it is, to make it even easier, grease the skids to even less engaged kind of teaching experiences and learning experiences, because I open up my Blackboard shell and I plug in the cartridge or the key or whatever, and I have all these great materials and tests and chapters, and I say read and take the test, and all of this idea of inquiry into different models of learning and social communities of learning, it gets lost. It doesn't have to be that way. In the same way, Google doesn't make us stupid, but in effect, that's what happens. So it seems to me it's kind of a hard position to be in, where I know from Martha's blogging and her material in this class that she is interested in engaging and exploring and exploratory learning, and at the same time, I don't think these products lend themselves that way, and they feed right into institutional myopia in not paying attention to the right things about education. So, I mean, how do you balance that? How do you bring these in a healthy way? That's part of citizenship. It's part of being a teacher. Unfortunately, too many just don't.
We're publishing to the demand of the marketplace. Chris, you and I had the conversation a couple weeks ago about the request I had from a district wanting to shut down all communication aspects of a learning management system that we have. They didn't want their teachers to be able to import YouTube videos into the learning management system. They didn't want their teachers to be able to email other teachers. They didn't want their students to be able to email. They didn't want their students to be able to upload pictures. They didn't want their students to be able to do multimedia presentations. They wanted strictly fill in the blank, multiple choice, true and false. They wanted a preset list of standards with no ability to change the standards or the flow of the lessons. It's a major district, a major district within a very large state that made that request. So from the commercial side of things, I can't publish the gold standard because I wouldn't sell enough to be able to keep the lights on publishing the gold standard, which is where we need to get to. And the key piece to that is driving teacher education and making teachers aware of what they can do with technology and where they can go with technology. And some of that is starting to happen, but we're years away from that. And layer on top of that, administrators who are not secure enough and to let their teachers truly teach with the tool. They lock it down.
Yeah, I
And
mean, it's an interesting dynamic, right? I feel the same way in many ways about MOOCs. MOOCs are terrible pedagogically, and but by themselves, they can be a fantastic resource to integrate into a real teaching experience that's being facilitated by an educator who cares and wants to inspire trust in their students. But that's we're all in this situation. You're just more obviously in it in terms of like you said, you're giving what the market demands, right? We're giving what the institution demands. We're teaching the way that we think the students are requesting through the eyes of the administrators. Like there's all these markets that we're serving. Those are often antithetical to innovation and exploration and pedagogy. And that's why, I mean, my generation, so to speak, of people engaged with education and technology, they're dropping like flies and getting out of the game when it comes to academia itself because of those strictures. And so it's obvious on a commercial basis with you, but I think we're all fighting in some way that fight, right? I mean, Jim, you went from out of an institution, and probably happily so, and I know that fight gets tiring, I guess, is the bottom line.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, the institutional stuff, like, that's where my heart is. I was doing it for 20 years, but, like, I mean, just look at what's happening in higher ed, in education in general. I mean, just watch the way that, like you said, teachers are disempowered, administrators are shutting down access to doing all this stuff, and yet, I don't know. I mean, I'm an optimist. I always am, but I just think that if you don't like the system you exist within, build your own. And so that's what I've spent my time doing. I don't get sucked into too much politics and to pretending that I taught in Brooklyn before I was I taught in an inner city school, and it was a very interesting lesson in trying to pretend that you're going to save people from anything. You know, like, the system is mean and it's big and it spits things out, and so you kind of got to nibble along the edges. You know, more of a Mad Max philosophy, right? than trying to overthrow the system. So I mean. I just think, like, if you build good stuff and people benefit from it. I mean, in my institutional role, I helped faculty and students. At Reclaim, I help faculty and students. I mean, I still do that, just from a different perspective. But I believe in the mission of higher ed. Like, I believe, like, there is a cultural legacy that we need to preserve, and that there is critical thinking that we need to imbue and, imagine. And it worked for me, and I can't imagine 30 years later it's broken. But there's so much bad rhetoric, you know what I mean? Like, I guess in some ways it's a nice break from all the rhetoric around it. One way or another, like, disrupt, it's broken, higher ed is broken, like, it gets tiring. It's that bubble thing again. And I don't know. I don't have anything intelligent to say.
There's certainly room to carve your own space. And I mean, I think in the mission of this class, I think, is to help provide ways to both think about that for the people in the class, but also for the students they teach and the public that they serve and their families and themselves. And so I kind of want to end on that optimistic note, and also remembering that it's tied to the personal. Everybody I know who stays and survives online and in this space and it's integrated into their lives and the things they care about. It's not just a remote consideration. And I think Linnea is bringing up some good points about the perspective of parents, not just in K-12, but particularly in K-12, and that there are the culture of fear and that there are reasons for these things. but remembering that there is room to carve your own space out, there is room to make these things happen. And again, this has all been from the beginning of the class, the whole idea of technological determinism and digital citizenship, and the idea that we need to be kind of the masters and not sleepwalk through it is an essential message. So I kind of want to thank you, Jim, for joining us for so long and end on an optimistic note, which is rare for me. So I'm glad you're here to balance that out. And thank you for your time. And I know, let the students know, he's at Jim Groom on Twitter. He always engages. If you engage with him, go to his blog, which I've shared with you all, and jump in. That's kind of what I did to learn anything I know, which may not be very much, but it's the only way I could learn it. Jump into these conversations.
Yeah, it's true. Well, thank you all. It was a pleasure. I'm sorry I talked so much, but
I'm
working on it. I'm in therapy.
Better than hearing me talk, trust me. So. All right. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.